Welcome. We are going to dive in here. Let me pray for us, and then we're going to get started. God and Father, thank you for this chance that we have to sit down together and talk a little bit practically about sharing the good news of the gospel with people and connecting with and communicating with them. Pray that you would be with us now and help us to be learning and growing and just be appointing opportunities for us to share the hope of Jesus with others. Pray all of this in your great name. Amen. All right. So, as we roll in here, first of all, a real quick, so here's the scoop, basically. So we are, in some ways, this is the final sermon of the 4-week, that's sort of asterisk 5-week sermon series on sharing Jesus that we did, because we spent 4 weeks talking about that calling. But one of the tricky things always about preaching through something like that is that, I always hope that preaching is practical and want to make it practical, but there's a level of practicalness that is really hard to get in a sermon, if that makes sense to you guys, because you're still wanting to kind of preach the word. And so our goal today is to talk through a couple of different related practical things. And so basically what we're going to do, so that you guys know what's going on, is we have 3 lessons that will all run together, but we'll have a break between the first and second. We'll have lunch between the second and third. And by the way, so that I don't forget to mention it, during the break between the first and second, Janae's going to be ordering lunch. And if you have any food allergies or issues like that, let her know, so that, because she'll put in the order. We just weren't sure, what turnout would be, because you never know with church things. And so I was like, well, we could have 5 people or we could have 30 people. And so we waited to order until we knew who would be here, so that we made sure that we had the right amount of food. But our goal today is to dig practically, specifically into sharing Jesus. But we're really going to do 3 things. So the first lesson is going to be seeing. That's going to be the shortest one. In some ways, that's going to be the one closest to some of the sermons we had and the least super concrete, because that's just going to be talking through a little bit more practically, getting to know the people around us, having opportunities to share Jesus. Second, we're going to talk about knowing, which is particularly knowing where people are at. And there we're going to dig very practically into saying, here's this person I'm sitting down across from. How do I kind of figure out where they're at spiritually? How do I know how to engage depending on where they're at? Does that make sense? And that's going to be, I have a flow chart, even though, as I'll say, you don't have to exactly follow the flow chart or something like that in order to try to make that concrete. And then our third section of sharing is going to be, some of you I know have been trained in different gospel presentations, but it's going to be a way of just presenting the gospel very concretely, and we're going to walk through that, and I'm going to show it to you, and then y'all are going to practice it with each other, and that's there. But the goal in all of this is just to give you some practical tools and skills, because I worry sometimes, I think especially evangelism is one of those areas, maybe especially for people that are more theologically inclined in those parts of the church, which we kind of are. We can kind of talk about the thing and why it's important and all of that, and never really buckle down and say, okay, here's how to really do it practically. So with all of that said, my one other note is that I'm going to roll through, but I am very comfortable pausing and answering questions. We'll also pause a few times to do things, as we kind of walk through this. And so feel free. You can raise your hand or wave at me, or just speak up, because you might not want to feel like you're in elementary school. But I'm happy to pause. And also, I will note that there will be a couple of points where I will have you do something. So if you don't have a pen or pencil, there are some back on that stand. But to start with, we're going to talk about seeing, which is to say, having open eyes to see the opportunities around us. I remember when I was, years ago, when I was working in retail, and I just remember being really struck this one time where I had, because of a sermon, I had actively been kind of praying for some opportunities to share the gospel with people, and had been kind of, thinking about that, praying about that. And I had a conversation with a coworker at work where they were sharing some things, and I walked away from that conversation, and 2 hours later I was like, oh, wow, that was totally an opportunity to share the gospel, and I just didn't see it, right? So part of the challenge is just that there are people around us and opportunities around us to talk about Jesus that we just don't see. And so to do that, we're basically going to do a couple of things. But first, I just want us to be aware of the fact, if you were here for the sermons, one of the things we said is that one of the challenges to sharing the gospel, especially in the modern era, is the way relationships have just broken down, like generally, and so we don't know the people around us. We don't really see the people around us. And so in order to process that and how we're doing with that first, I'm going to have us do an activity. So if you want to open up your thing to this neighborhood map, which is the first page, I'm going to have us all fill it out in just a minute, but I'll give a word about what we're going to do. So one of the obvious places to start thinking about people that are around you is the people that live immediately around you. And we'll talk in a minute about coworkers and stuff like that. But this is just a useful diagnostic tool to ask, do I know the people living around me? Does that make sense? And I want to just say up front that the people that made this neighborhood map thing that I learned to do this from, according to them, only like 10% of people can actually fill out even just the names of all the people around them. But what we're going to do here is we're going to just take that neighborhood map and we're just going to do, I'm going to ask you to do 2.5 things. One, write the names of the people that are in those houses. Does that make sense? So it's laid out like a hashtag. Oh, hold on. It's laid out like a hashtag. You're in the middle. And so you're thinking about the kind of 8 houses around your house. Now, if your neighborhood is weird shaped, I actually did one of these because we just moved too. And mine, I moved all the houses around because we live on a circle. And I've been filling it out as I've started meeting neighbors and stuff the last 2 weeks. But go ahead and we'll pause for a couple minutes and try to fill in first their names. And it's the half is just if they have any kids, their names or number of kids or whatever, you know. And then 1 or 2 things about them, like what they do for a living or what they're passionate about, something like that, that you would have to have had a conversation with them in order to fill out. And go ahead and just try to work through that. And again, because I know a few of you are rule follower perfectionists, it's okay if it doesn't quite fit on the grid. Just pick the 8 houses closest to you and think about those. But we're going to pause here and let you guys go ahead and fill that out. I'm going to go ahead and jump back in, but you can keep writing if you're still writing. I don't want to do the thing where some people awkwardly sit while other people are still writing down people around them. But let me suggest to take this and kind of finish it up later if you don't want to do it right now. Here's the reason I started with that. First of all, like I said, do not sit, if you're sitting here feeling really guilty and beating yourself up, don't do that, right? That's not what this is for. And I will readily acknowledge some neighborhoods weirdly are just very private and others are much more social. Like I was reflecting on that as I got ready for this class because the last neighborhood, that I was in for the last year, I could not have filled out the hashtag chart because several of the people in houses I don't think I ever saw. Or they would, the garage door would go up and they'd drive in and it would close behind them. And the circle that we just moved into, 5 people from 5 of the houses sit outside and drink together, in the middle of the street at night every weekend. And so last night I actually walked over and met even some more people. It's very easy, right, to meet a bunch of those people. But that is a good activity to start with, to just reflect on, here's these people that live really close to me and that often I don't know, right? I'm not connected with these people that are literally the neighbors, right? When Jesus says, love your neighbors, he's not talking about neighborhoods in the modern sense, but probably one of the simplest applications is to say, here's the people around me. And so that is a place for you to start thinking about, just as you fill that out, the houses that are blank or that you don't know a lot about the people, proactively take a chance to kind of meet them. And you can interestingly, so there was this study I remember seeing a few years ago where they asked people on buses, public buses, it was 2 questions, which was, would you like it if someone struck up a conversation with you and introduced themselves? Which was the first question. And the second question was, how many people on the bus do you think would like it if you struck up a conversation with them and introduced themselves? And interestingly, 85% of people actually said they'd kind of like it if somebody introduced themselves to them on the buses. But they estimated that less than 10% of the people on the buses would like it if they struck up a conversation with them, right? There's this sort of perception versus reality gap that's true of neighbors too. How many of you, if one of your neighbors that you don't know came over and was like, hey, I'm Bob, and introduce himself, you'd think, wow, that's great, I'm glad I met them. Like most of us would, right? But how many of us, when we see that person getting out of their car, going into the house, we're like, oh, they do not want me to go say hello to them. There's that same perception gap that's in play there. So I put that there first just to say that is a good place to start as you think about looking around you, seeing the people around you, and starting to form relationships. And then you can fill it out in your own time, or you can jot it down while I talk. But underneath that, I also wrote other opportunities, because obviously besides the people in your neighborhood immediately around you, there are other people that are also around us. What are some of the examples of that? Work. That's probably the biggest one. And frankly, I mean, I'm kind of weird as a pastor, although I used to work outside of, church settings. But for most of us, even more than our neighbors, those are the people that we're around the most, right? So work is a very obvious place to see people, get to know people. And in fact, you could do something like this neighborhood map, like if you work at a cubicle is the obvious way, right? For the people in the offices or cubicles around you, right? Many of us don't have those kinds of jobs, but still you can think about like who's on my team, who do I interact with during the day, who's in the break room, whatever the questions are, and look for those opportunities. What are other places? Yeah. Sure, that's two of the big ones, but family is an obvious one, right? Family is always a little tricky when we talk about outreach because it's a good place to do it, but obviously those relationships are some of the most complicated relationships that we have, right? And so trying to have spiritual conversations with them are, it's fraught. Like I know that tension of like, oh yeah, my uncle who's not a believer who also like hates me because I did these things, in the past that really ticked him off, that I can tell you the story sometime. Whatever. These are the people that knew me when I was like 16, and nobody would want to listen to me if they knew me when I was 16, which is part of why I'm glad I'm not ministering in the town that I grew up in, right? So it's fraught, but at the same time, those are also these built-in close relationships. And as we're able to have those connections, that's great. And then, other activities, sports, things like that. Other thoughts on where we encounter people? Anything else we want to add? Yeah. Yep, and classmates' parents for a lot of us. And obviously those of you that are in school can be a setting where you can meet and connect with people. Any other? Okay.
There are certain organizations that we belong to
Mm-hmm.
where you meet quite a few people.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that can be a good place too. So there are all these people around us, right? We talked about neighbors. There's all these people at work, at school, things like that. But we often struggle to actually even maybe know those people's names, right? Or to know much about them or to make those connections. And so out of that, I just want to suggest 4 skills that I've been trying over the last few years to think about developing. That's the next page of your handout too. And you're going to notice I'm about to cheat. It's actually 6 skills, but 2 of them are pairs. That I think a lot about just how can I cultivate these things. And so the first skill is just noticing. And that's part of what we've been practicing right now, right? So part of noticing is just noticing that there are these people who are actually people. I, for several years, was a barista at Starbucks. I've had a lot of weird jobs. As a side note, I tell these stories, and I always think about one of my stepdaughters once. I said something about a job that I had, and she's like, "You worked like every job, Eric." But I was a barista for a few years at a Starbucks, and I kind of remember the interesting, like 90% of the people that came in did not see you, right? You were just sort of like a cog in the coffee delivery machine. But then 10% of the people that came in saw you, right? Noticed you as a person and knew who you were. And there was, they would be regulars, but by regular, that doesn't mean they came in every day, because there were lots of people that came in every day and didn't do this, right? But they were regulars in the sense that they would actually get to know your names and talk with you and ask you questions and remember things. And I can still see the faces of a couple of those people because, even though I had very limited interactions that ultimately boiled down to delivering coffee to them, they actually made the space to notice me. And part of noticing is also paying attention to things like one of the big ones is just, how is this person seem to be feeling right now, right? It's interesting. I mean, have you guys ever had the experience where you're at a coffee shop or something and there's someone sitting next to you for like an hour or two and suddenly you realize like this person's crying? And, I mean, which should be something that I notice, and maybe you engage, maybe you don't, right? But the fact that we don't even see that stuff, again, is a part of noticing. So the first skill is just noticing, trying to pay attention. The second one is being with people. Being with people, which is to say, even if you notice the people around you, there's this deep chasm that it feels like you have to cross in order just to actually be present with them, right? Like I often picture people as all in little pods. It's like when you're sitting at a traffic light and everyone's in their own car, right? And you're all kind of isolated from each other. Don't do this at a traffic light. But the act of like rolling down your proverbial window and actually making a connection and talking with a person feels like almost that wrong, which again, don't do that in traffic. But when you're out in public, when you're with a neighbor, right? One of the interesting things in our world is that historically, it was very normal for people to just spend time with each other, even if they didn't know each other well, right? You'd like be sitting out on your front porch and your neighbor's out on their front porch and one of you walks over and you have a conversation and just spend time sharing the same space. And that actually can feel really uncomfortable to a lot of us because of the ways that the modern world works. And so being with means figuring out and developing just comfort with saying, let's actually relationally engage for the moment. Let me give you one example, then I'll ask for a few more. The one obvious example is just eating with people, right? Offering to share a meal with somebody. Some of you guys I know are more used to doing that, but there is no reason that you can't just to your neighbor say, hey, like I'm cooking this thing, do you want some of it? And maybe you eat together, maybe you even just give it to them. It was, actually, Amber, I think Andrew the other day told me there's some guy in your neighborhood who makes like paellas and things and just sets them out on the street, right? For people. It was something like that, I mean, not on the street, but would just like offer it. That came out wrong. Would like set out and offer it to, the people in the neighborhood to like, hey, you want some of this? So sharing food. And I may be sharing that because I really love food and cooking. And so that's obviously some of you guys I've cooked for and you know that. But what are some other ways that we can cross that kind of gap and develop that skill of just actually spending time with people?
In that same vein, I was thinking our neighbors have an abundance of herbs in their garden right now. And
Yeah.
they're being very neighborly. I don't have a person, but they're texting the group. Yeah. Come and pick some.
Yeah.
Plant a garden. Working out with people.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's funny how you see like all the people, right? Like say on your block that are going out jogging sometimes at the same time, but somehow they're not with each other, right? Yeah.
Often it helped if they're needing help. Like when our new neighbors moved in, it was an icy, cold day.
Yeah.
They parked their car in the street and they just went out and they said, we'll move the car. I was like, no, do you want to park in my driveway? Get it out of the road.
Yeah.
Until the moving truck comes in. And,
That's good.
just those, if you see them,
Yeah. Yeah. Offering to help. And actually that's going to, in some ways, tie into one of our whole other skills. So that's a good. Any other? I also just think about trying to do fun stuff with people. I remember having this thought, and I don't watch sports, so I don't actually do this, but I remember once it was like nighttime and I was going for a walk, and I noticed like 3 houses on the same block that like the same football game, because you could see into their living rooms. Not creepy, right? You're just walking and they've got their big screens, and like the same football game is playing in like 3 different living rooms of people that live within like a football field's distance from each other. And like, man, like they'd probably in some ways be happier people if they were watching those games with each other, right? So yeah, just sharing things like that. Okay. Third skill, which is the first of that's cheating, is asking and listening. So, anyone here think they're good at listening? A few of you actually are pretty good, but I think we all recognize it is much easier for us to talk at people, right? It's much easier for us to kind of, or even just banter with people than it is to really listen to them. And so something that's really a gift to people Eugene Peterson, in a book about pastoring, comments that one of the best gifts that pastors can give people is just to listen to them, right? Is to really say, I'm going to try to be with you in a way that hears what you're saying, not in terms of how I'm supposed to respond, but just in terms of making you feel heard and understood as a person, right? Just going into a conversation saying, I'm going to do that. And connected with that is asking questions, especially in a world where we're not good at listening. Asking questions is a way to kind of open that door that's also really a gift to people. And by questions, what I mean is not just like, is that your car in the driveway questions, right? But like one of the classic ways that I think about it is, what do you think about blank, right? Like, that's a question that like, hey, like we're talking about this thing, or, you mentioned this thing. What do you think about that? I've relaxed this a little bit for myself as I've gotten older, but early on in pastoring, especially when I didn't feel like I knew how to navigate it and felt some of the tensions there, I had a rule that said I would never talk about anything political, period. Like I would never share my views about anything political. And for years I like rigidly held that, and that's still actually kind of my default posture as a pastor, but I'm more comfortable, kind of saying some things about what I think, and I have weird political views. But what was interesting is that people wanted to talk about politics a lot, right? Like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but, and so what I tried to discipline myself to do is just to ask them questions about what they thought. Like, to just be like, oh, so what do you think about this? So, why do you think that? You got to be careful not to slide into making them feel like you're arguing with them, like, well, what about this flaw in your logic? That's not probably the way to do it. But what was interesting to me was a couple of things. One was that oftentimes on that topic, as people talked more about it, like what they initially said wasn't really what they thought, right? It was sort of like, but two, what was even more interesting to me was how often it was clear to me that those people had never had the chance to actually just have someone curiously inquire and ask follow-up questions to try to understand their views. And with politics, sometimes that was a gift and sometimes that got kind of complicated, but that was a season where I feel like I actually really realized that. And so I do sometimes with people try to do this thing, especially someone who's guilty of talking too much often and not listening well, where I will sit in conversations and say, I'm just going to try for a while to just ask questions and listen. Doing that with the people around you, doing that with a coworker, doing that with a neighbor really opens the door. And especially if you have some relationship, and especially if you've been a good listener in little ways, man, you can ask basically anything, and most people will share something about it. They might not share the whole thing, but yeah, I mean, it's a powerful thing. And then lastly is what I'm going to call giving and receiving. So giving and receiving, and I especially mean by here help, service, things. Does that make sense? The giving part, I think we maybe intuit more, and a lot of us, some of us at least, are gifted in service and helps and, and see those ways, and so we're happy to be like, oh, hey, neighbor, let me jump in and try to help you with this thing. But if that's not a thing you do, that's huge, right? Like if, you mentioned like a neighbor needing a place to park, if you see someone who's moving into a house nearby, if you see someone who is, out working in the yard, if there's somebody, especially if, say, there's a widow or someone like that, like a single parent that you see like, oh, they could maybe use some help. Offering to help serve them can be a huge blessing. I had a friend who just, there was a single mom living by them. They developed a really cool relationship with and ended up like mentoring her kids and stuff like that. And it was purely because they went over and were just like, hey, like, not, like, I hope this doesn't sound weird or anything, but I've noticed like you're a single parent and I know, you're gone a lot working and I can tell like it's hard for you to keep up with your lawn. So would you mind if I just went ahead and took care of, like mowed your lawn and stuff for you while I was doing mine? And obviously that's a tricky conversation, but in that case, like it was actually a really good one. And they started doing that and got to know her and her kids. And yeah, there were really cool connections that were made there. And at the same time, and this is actually maybe more powerful, but it's way harder, especially I think for us as Midwesterners, is receiving, meaning asking for help and receiving help from the people around us as well. I had a neighbor offer to help us move stuff the other day while we were moving, while I was unloading stuff from the house. And boy, everything, all of the like German immigrant background, rural Midwestern family that I inherited wanted to just say no, right? Because it's, because that was the code that I grew up with very much of like, you always offer to help and you never let people help you, and you always offer to pay and you never let people pay for you, right? Like, which doesn't work, but is the way that people thought, and why some of my family will have hour-long arguments about who's going to pay for dinner. But receiving help is actually a way to welcome people in. Does that make sense? And so saying, yeah, absolutely, help me out. Or even more than that, if you know a neighbor is good at something, asking them for help with it. You're actually making yourself vulnerable in that place. And you're honoring them as significant and having gifts, and that can be a really powerful way to make that connection. All right. So those are, and I know this is sort of practical with the asterisk if it's still a little theoretical. Like I said, we're going to get even more practical in the next session. But let me ask this. As you look at that list, are there things that strike you that you're thinking about that you'd like to share with others of like, here's a way that I feel like I could grow in that, or that I'm good at it, that's been blessed, or yeah, where does that strike you as you're sitting with that kind of list of skills to develop?
So I was just thinking on the being with one, as someone who loves planning, like I almost have to create the time to do that, or like structure the time to do that, because even some of our neighbors that we know pretty well, it can be easy for me to be like, well, I'm mowing right now, and so
Yeah.
I don't have time to come over and talk to you, right?
That is so true. Just needing to make the time to engage in a busy schedule, or to have the mentality. I noticed myself doing that last night. I mentioned we're in a new neighborhood, and to be honest, part of it was that I'm about to teach on this, and so I was thinking about it. But like I said, there's a couple of families in our neighborhood that I'll just apparently, at least on weekend nights, just sit out on the sidewalk or in someone's yard and drink and talk. And obviously, I should go introduce myself. But I was running some loads of stuff. I had borrowed Nate's truck. I was running some loads of stuff from one house to the other. And I'm in the middle of that, and I see them out there. And like my first thought is like, oh man, like I'm in the middle of this. Otherwise, I would go say hello. And then it's like, being very transparent, it's like, I'm about to teach on how you need to be neighborly and get to know your neighbors. But, I'm like, no, like, I need to stop this and go. And, I went over there for like 40 minutes and kept an eye on the time and then went back and finished up what I was doing. But yeah, that's a good one, Brad, that it's easy to have them, to have that mentality of like, I'm doing things, and so I don't have time to engage. Don?
I think that the noticing is very important, and one of my shortcomings, all of us, is that we don't pray enough for the Holy Spirit to make us aware what's around us.
Yeah.
And I think if we actually do that and ask the Lord to bring someone to us or give us an opportunity, He will do it. And then we need to be aware that, hey, this is an answer to what I've asked for. Now I've got to do the other things that
Yes.
go along with that.
Yep.
But I think that's a lot of times we're negligent in asking for that because we're
Yeah.
afraid He's going to answer the prayer and you're going to have to talk to somebody or do something. Okay.
Yes. Yes. Being prayerful in that. And you're right that in some ways, these are really the foundation then of these, right? That it's doing these things first that then give you the opportunities to do the others. And?
When we moved into our neighborhood, and even as other people have moved in, like when I have that moment of I'm bringing groceries in, and I had an idea of what I was doing next, right? That's kind of how life goes. But the very fact that all of a sudden I thought I should go blank, whether it's talk to that neighbor who's out in that yard or whatever, realizing that that's probably the Holy Spirit because I on my own don't think that way. And it just taking
there's often that prompting. Yeah, and learning to listen to that, not just in this, in many areas of life, right? Of being able to name like, oh, like the Spirit's kind of nudging me to, to do this or be open to this. Yeah, and then being open.
I think under asking,
Mhm.
if we get to a place where we are going to ask them questions,
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of us, it's very difficult. You ask a question, it's to just don't say anything else.
Yes.
It's difficult not to say anything, so you can listen. And we need to be, when we ask the question, sometimes we formulate what we think the answer is going to be, but it's not what you're going to hear.
Well, and what's real hard is when they don't give the answer that you think or don't say it the way that you want. Yeah.
Waiting, you just sit there.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. On question asking and answering to, or in listening to, you also, especially with some people, have to get comfortable with some silence, right? Yeah, I mean, silence is a powerful tool in general, actually, in interacting with people, and a lot of us really struggle with it, but just leaving the space to hear. Okay, so like I said, this first section is meant to then lead into a discussion about how to have spiritual conversations. But there's one more practical thing we're going to talk about with this first, kind of simpler, like bigger picture section before we zoom in. And that's then, okay, you can do all of this stuff, and it can still be a struggle to know how to transition into having a spiritual conversation. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. I'm intentionally using that language because I'm not just talking about like sharing a gospel presentation with them, right? Spiritual conversations mean a lot of things, but they're all kind of invitations, depending on where the person is, with them to engage with kind of deeper realities of God and life in the world and things like that. And in some ways, that is I feel like a separate thing, because there are certain people, because they're extroverts, or because really extroverted, or because they're like trained in sales or something like that at least some of these things they'll naturally do. Does that make sense? Like, they've, for other reasons, learned some of those relational skills. So the other thing I want to talk about here in this section of seeing people is sort of seeing how and when to start kind of engaging in that way. And so let me just say, first of all, I think there's two categories of situations that lead to spiritual conversations. The first set of situations are the ones that just happen to us without us doing anything. Does that make sense? And those, as you build relationships with people, especially if you're open about faith and life and stuff like that, like some of those will just naturally come up, right? I already had again, with one of my new neighbors in the last week, right, in meeting them, and this happens because you're a pastor, so it comes up way sooner. But he's like, oh, that's great. Like, I'm not religious at all, and now because of the timing of it and because of the fact that I literally just met this guy, my response there was simply to say, like, I look forward to getting to know you, and at some point we'll probably talk about that. Like, I said that and just left it there, but which I can get away with also. Because I'm a pastor, but there are times that happens. Does that make sense? There are times that somebody that you're like, oh yeah, like I've got this church thing that I'm going to on Saturday, and they're like, I hate the church, and and you're like, oh, here's a chance to talk about spiritual things. The 1 Peter 3 verse that gets quoted a lot, we quote it in the sermon series, but in your hearts honor Christ, the Lord is holy, being prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect, right? So there are times that people will just ask you about things or want to engage with things. And so that's the first category of opportunities. And the key thing in those is just to name that that's what's happening and be willing to engage in a spiritual conversation, right? In some ways, those are the easier ones, but it's still the thing that happens, right? When that can happen, where I kind of freeze up and struggle to engage with it. And sometimes that's because of fear, and sometimes that's because I feel like I'm busy and not taking time and not really noticing people. And sometimes that's because I feel like I don't know what to say, and that's why in the next section we're going to talk about kind of what's the things that you're trying to work through with that. But there is a second category, though, too, that I think is important to name, and that is what I think of as is opening the door moments to spiritual topics, which is to say, there are plenty of people who you will know who don't just out of the blue say, hey, can you tell me about your faith in Jesus, right? And you're in relationship with those people. And you don't want to try to force those people into having a certain conversation, right? People will not react well to that. But what you do want to do is to create opportunities for openness to that. And the way I think about that, this can look different, and in just a minute I'm going to ask us to brainstorm, like, what are some examples of this? But the way I think about that is that there are things you can do to open the door. And rather than, because we're going to brainstorm examples in a minute, I'll give you an example in a completely different area of what I mean by this, because it actually feels really similar to me, which is, to all of my kids and Leah's kids, but for me, with my kids especially, they have some significant trauma and grief history, right? And one of the things that everyone that studies it tells you about grief and trauma and kids is that you do not force them to engage with it, right? Like on your timetable, because they need the space to kind of wrestle through that, and there's time, like part of their compartmentalizing is important and good and healthy, right? You know, they're not going to engage with those things because they're not ready to, and it'll just, yeah. I think that makes sense to everybody. But nonetheless, you also don't want to move through life in a way that never gives them chances to talk about that. And so the way that I learned to kind of do that, and some of this is just from trial and error, and some of this is from talking to counselors and things, is there's ways to kind of open the door, if they want to process that, to say something like, oh yeah, your mom really liked this thing, or, oh, are you, missing mommy, or, does that make sense? Like, there's certain questions you can ask. And there's plenty of times where it's very clear you kind of open that door and it's shut again. And that's not a failure. Does that make sense? Because what you're not trying to do is make them have the conversation. In fact, maybe they shouldn't, but you're opening the door enough that they know they have permission to have that conversation, or invited to start that conversation if they want to. And in some ways, I think that the same sort of principle often applies to talking with people about spiritual stuff. So let's brainstorm together. What are some examples of ways that you can open the door and just see, like, would you be interested in having this conversation, or what's going on with that?
One of the famous questions you can open the door with is, if the situation is right, you can say, do you have any kind of a religious background? What's
Yeah.
your religious background?
Yep.
They'll say, someone will just shut you off, and they'll just say, well, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
But that's one way you can open the door.
That's a great, like, question and listen kind of example of that, right? When you get to know somebody is, what is your background, or are you, religious, or what are your faith views, or whatever, and let them kind of share. And you can often ask a few follow-up questions too, right? When someone says, like, well, I'm Catholic, there's a big difference between meaning, like, I got baptized Catholic and sometimes on Easter went to Mass, and, like, I go to Mass 3 times a week and I'm really engaged with my faith, right? Like, those are two very different, people. So you can ask those follow-up questions and kind of learn about it, but that opens up the door, yeah.
Like a line I use a lot with people is just, so part of it's like what Ann was talking about earlier, just being attentive to the spirit. So, like, if a conversation starts going in a spiritual direction, like, hey, tell me more about that. Just
Yeah.
curiosity for the person.
Yep. Yeah, one of the things that happens with listening and asking questions is that, not in a manipulative way, but you still have some freedom to move a conversation in a certain way, right? Based off of what you ask about, out of what the person said. Like, if someone says something to you, you can ask about different parts of that. So yeah, just tell me more about that is a good invitation to that.
One that's kind of similar to that, when we, for some reason at work, we complain a lot about our
Mhm.
life situation, and one that I'll use is, wow, that's really hard. How do you get through that? How do you handle
Yeah.
this fight with your husband? How do you handle your ex being so mean?
Yeah. A variation of that I use a lot is, so for me, my spiritual life is a big part of that how do you, for you, like, how do you process that, right? Because I know that is also giving them permission, if they don't want to talk about spiritual stuff, to just be like, nope, and and shut the door on it, while also, kind of hearing what they want.
And tied to how is also why.
Mhm. Yeah.
I have guys at work that are always asking me stuff.
Mhm.
So I ask them, why? Why are you asking me that?
Yeah.
To get them to open up about where they're thinking.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts about that? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. That's good.
I'm always scared they're gonna tell me something I can't handle. And I'm just being honest, like,
Yeah.
but then, just remembering that you can always offer pray. When my new
Mhm.
husband left her, we had never, like, I'd gotten the understanding they were not interested in anything to do with church, but she would let me pray for her.
Yeah.
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 Scared. Too big.
Yeah. All right, here's the plan then. We kind of talked through all that stuff, right? Seeing, noticing people, getting to a point where we might have a spiritual conversation. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But we're going to have a little break. But before that, and I don't know how used to this you guys are, but I'm going to ask y'all to pair up with somebody and just spend 2 or 3 minutes praying together. Not your spouse. Let's make you guys be sociable. I see Chris immediately put his arm around Ann. Let's try to cross those lines a little bit. But let's have people pair up quick and just spend a couple of minutes just praying together, maybe over some of the people on your list, maybe over some of the opportunities that you're seeing. But again, let me just stress, because I'm going to say this several times over the course of this, right? If at the end of this conversation you're just feeling guilty, right? Just bear in mind that that's not actually usually a productive feeling, right? There's godly guilt that kind of leads to repentance and change, but any guilt beyond that is not actually, from the Spirit, and it often leads to discouragement. And so just breathe out and remind yourself, like, in all of this, Jesus loves you. You belong to him. He is at work in the world. He doesn't need you to accomplish his purposes. And so just, take that breath. And instead, the question that I always try to ask people is just like, look, like you are righteous and free in Christ, so just what does it look like to take the next step? So as you kind of pray through those people, just be thinking about what does it look like to take the next step in growing in this area. But with that said, we're going to go ahead and pray for a couple minutes, and then I'm going to give everybody, we will reconvene here at 11. It is 10:47 right now. And then one other note, if you weren't in here when we announced it, so we'll have lunch after the next session. Janae's going to order it here in a few minutes. And if you have food allergies or anything, just let her know, and she can try to take care of that in ordering. All right, go ahead and find somebody, and let's pray.